Welcome to Zubair's Bookshelf, the podcast where we explore the world of books and ideas with authors who inspire us. I'm your host, Zubair Kamar, and today I'm honored to have Dr. Koert Debeuf with us. He is the author of the new book, The Influence of Averroes on European Thought, The Disappearance of Latin Averroism from the History of Philosophy. Together we'll uncover the story of Averroes, real name Ibn Rushd, his profound impact on European thought, and how his legacy was erased from the history of European philosophy. Dr. Koert Debeuf, a warm welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, and thank you for having me.
Going to the first question, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you. I'm actually born in the Netherlands and grew up in Belgium, so in Bruges, which was a major trade center in the Middle Ages and also in the Renaissance. So quite a few big names actually happened to come together. But after a while studying in Leuven, I moved to Cairo. So in 2011, I studied ancient history at the University of Leuven and Bologna in Italy, and started working pretty quickly into politics. So I was the advisor of Belgian Prime Minister from 2003 to 2009, and then went to the European Parliament as Chief of Staff, the leader of the Liberal group at the Parliament. And it was then when the Arab Spring, or I rather call it Arab Revolution, started, that we in the Parliament realized that we had no idea what was going on. So they actually sent me in order to try to understand what was going on in these revolutions. And if also we could find some people who were interested to connect with the European Parliament. It is actually there where I started to explore and read quite a lot about the Arab world, of course. And when I came back to Brussels, I became editor-in-chief of a European newspaper, and also started actually a PhD, well, first in political science, but then quickly in philosophy. So in order to need to explore the links that I thought were missing in our history of philosophy between connecting the Middle East and Europe. So, and after finishing that, I actually became a professor Middle East at Brussels University, and since briefly also a professor in international relations. So while also giving course in philosophy on the humanism in a global context. So my life has had many lives so far, and that's where I am. At the same time, I'm also a research fellow, at the Center for the Research of Intractable Conflict in Oxford, at Oxford University. So where I love to work. By the way, also for my PhD, I did a lot of research, because contrary to many other libraries, I mean, the old libraries of Oxford have never been destroyed, so you still can see most of the works that you are studying actually in their original first print, or even before print. So for example, one of the first translations of Al-Khwarizmi, the great Persian mathematician, into Latin, so I could read there. So and you can discover many things if you read things in the original book, in the original language. So I was very lucky that I could do that in Oxford.
Fantastic. That's a very exciting education and life you have. So what inspired you to write this book on Averroes? Is there any particular moment or discovery that sparked your interest in Averroes and his legacy in European philosophy?
Well, it started in a different way. My education is a typical European education. I mean, on the history of philosophy, briefly, it's all about the Greeks. It started with Thales of Miletus, and so forth. We go to Aristotle, Plato. Then that was forgotten. We got into the Middle Ages. Then in the Renaissance, they found this philosophy back into the abbeys, and then Renaissance and philosophy restarted as well as the history of philosophy. Also, the other parts of my education were pretty Eurocentric. That, for me, the big change when I first visited actually Damascus in Syria in 2009. While, of course, after 9/11, everyone in the world had this picture of Arabs being mostly angry people who are always fighting and so forth. So, and I must honestly say that my view back then was also, well, a bit of the same. So pretty Eurocentric indeed. I will never forget, I entered the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, which is a fantastic mosque. I mean, with so many historical layers in the construction itself, but also inside. And what I saw was on the inner court, families were picnicking, children were playing inside the mosque. Some people were taking a nap because it was very warm outside. So it was so quiet. It was so nice. And I thought, how could it have been so wrong? I mean, how could I have such a wrong view about an entire region, about an entire world, basically? So there started my fascination for what have I missed in my worldview, first of all, but secondly, also in my education. And as I'm very interested in philosophy, I quickly stumbled up to the name of Averroes, of whom did hear once or twice at university, talking as kind of a translator, and thanks to whom we still have Aristotle. But that picture was wrong. And so I started digging into it really with the passion that these links are perhaps at the beginning point. I was like looking for how interconnected are both regions and what do I not know. And if I don't know it, maybe that's the case for many people. So that's the start of my journey, actually.
Very interesting. Thank you, Dr. Debeuf. While researching for this book, did you encounter any challenges accessing certain sources, or were there any surprising discoveries that stood out?
There are quite a few. One of which is that a very particular one actually is that the long. I mean, first of all, Averroes has made commentaries on Aristotle, and these commentaries he made three different kind of commentaries: short one, middle one, and long ones. The long one is, let's say, perhaps the most important one because it's the most elaborate one. Well, the long one has been lost in Arabic. So the only thing we have is actually a translation into Latin. And what I learned is that the first translations into Latin from Arabic and were not very good. So, for example, what they did was they just translated words, so not phrases, which means that it's very hard to read, and sometimes phrases don't make sense at all. So if you only translate words on themselves, then it is, yeah, it's sometimes unreadable. So on this long commentary, we have a Latin translation from the beginning of the 13th century, and that translation is not very good. And we cannot go back to the original Arabic to see what did Averroes actually mean. So we have to work with a bad translation, which makes the work much, much harder, of course. And also no good translations of this Latin translation into other languages like French or English. So in French, now we have one. So you have to work on the Latin, which makes things very challenging.
Absolutely, and that sounds fascinating. While doing your research, or before doing your research, were there any people who inspired you to make such discoveries and to set the narrative right?
Oh, absolutely. And here we come up to an interesting point, in my opinion. That is that in the English-speaking world, there has not been written, there's not a long tradition, let me say, on studying the influence of Averroes into European intellectual history. However, in France, but also in Italy, this tradition is much older. So this has several reasons. So, and what I did when I started my research is actually go to Paris and meet with a few of these experts. Jean-Baptiste Brunet, for example, Catherine, I lost her name, sorry. So, but also to Cambridge to see one of the very few people who did know something about it. And so I did a little tour in actually also Oxford, Cambridge, mostly Paris. And what I did is actually when I was writing chapters and so forth, I could send it to them to ask for their opinion. So what I have been very lucky and very happy for, absolutely, is that the world authorities on the topic, that they have been helping me. So, and that's for a young researcher, and with young, I mean not in age necessarily, that's a massive, massive asset.
Fascinating, fascinating. Very intriguing. Thank you. I think now we can get into the book. What is the landscape in terms of the research done on Averroes and his contribution to Europe's intellectual legacy? Are there just a few books in English, or maybe even less than that, or more? That's the first question. The second question is, what gaps, if any, were you trying to fill when researching and writing your book? Was there anything in previous research that needed to be elaborated on or discussed more?
What I noticed is that most of the work or the research that has been done in English was actually based on French research. And with French, I mean not just Paris, but also Leuven. Leuven University had, before 68, was Francophone and Dutch speaking. This is a Belgian story. So, and most of the research was done also in Leuven and in Paris. Leuven from a more Catholic perspective, namely from what they called Neo-Thomism. So they wanted to dig up Thomas Aquinas in the new turbulent times of the 19th and 20th century in order to fight atheism, actually. So it had a mission in Leuven. But they were very much indeed also on which philosophers in the 13th century were influenced or not by Averroes and Averroists. In France, on the other hand, you had, for example, Etienne Gilson, which was a very big name in medieval philosophy, and the people who actually worked with him later on. So this tradition, which exists up to today, they have been also been studied. Because, of course, the influence of Averroes was in the first place a thing of Paris. Paris University was founded in 1200, and that was exactly the moment when first translations of Aristotle and a little bit later of Averroes were being done in Latin. So in this new university, suddenly this new knowledge that was completely unknown before that in Europe flooded, let's say, the faculties of theology and philosophy. So for them, let's say in Europe, where Greek knowledge, but also Arabic knowledge was largely unknown, suddenly within a few years' time, things were translated and became known. And that gave a intellectual, earthquake. So, and of course, because this happened mostly in Paris, it's also, I think, normal that this is mostly French research. So what I saw is that in English, I think in some of the research that's been done in English, it's not very refined. I mean, there are quite a few mistakes, and I found that quite disturbing, honestly speaking. So that's why I saw it my mission to have put the insights that are on the French research to put it also into English-speaking publication. So I'm not saying that all publications in English are shallow, but many actually. So I found that a surprise, honestly speaking. Yeah.
Very interesting. So going into the book more, just to have the audience know a little bit more about Averroes, can you tell us a little bit about him, who he was, where he came from, and what influenced him in terms of Greek philosophy, rationalism, and so forth?
Yes. But before I do that, one more thought I would like to bring into the equation, which is that Europe finds itself, let's say, that there are the Greek heritage, they say, is European. But actually the Greek heritage is also Arabic. So, because when Greek philosophy actually died in Europe in the start of the Middle Ages, it was very much alive in the Arab world. So, first of all, it was in Alexandria, and then the Library of Alexandria was destroyed in the 4th century. So this knowledge went actually via around to Baghdad. There was a tradition, a Greek and also Christian tradition, but also pagan tradition, to comment on Aristotle. But one of the most famous commentators and the one who really understood Aristotle was Al-Farabi in Baghdad, who was born in 1870 to 1950. I mean, his successor intellectually was Ibn Sina or Avicenna. So in this tradition also went to Spain, where it was very much alive was a strong philosophical tradition. Now, Averroes was born in Cordoba, the capital of Al-Andalus, so Muslim Spain, in 1126, and he died in Marrakesh in 1198. He was the son of a judge, the Qadi, the main judge of Cordoba, and he himself also became a judge. However, he was also very interested in philosophy, and this line of long philosophy tradition in Spain, I mean, his master or teacher was Ibn Tufail, also a pretty well-known philosopher who wrote quite a few interesting books. And it was Ibn Tufail who brought Averroes to the Caliph of Cordoba. And the Caliph wanted to understand Aristotle, but for everyone who has been reading Aristotle knows that it is a very hard read, certainly his books on logic. So he asked to Averroes or Ibn Rushd to comment for him, to explain Aristotle to him. And so Averroes was in this long tradition of commentators, but he became the commentator also in Latin Europe, known because he understood perhaps Aristotle best. So he had a career as a judge, as a Muslim judge on the one hand. So he was also interpreting, of course, Islamic law. That was his job. And on the other hand, he was also a philosopher in the Greek Arabic tradition. So the interesting combination of that is that he also had to deal with the question, what is the difference, between the truth of revelation, the truth of the Quran and the Hadith on the one hand, and the truth of science or philosophy on the other hand. Or clarity, philosophy and science was, for many, many centuries, the same thing. So that was actually until the 19th century, that was the same, science and philosophy. So he was actually excelling in both sides. At the end of his life, there was Almohads took over from the Almoravids in Morocco and Spain. And there was a small period of misunderstanding about philosophy, and they actually exiled Averroes to a small village near Cordoba and burned his books. But luckily not all were burned, because many were saved and brought to Cairo. But 1 year later, the Caliph in Marrakesh understood that all this was a mistake, and so he was again being an advisor, but he died 1 year later in Marrakesh in 1198.
Very interesting. Thank you for that, Dr. Debeuf. This gives us a good background and understanding of Averroes' life. Next, can you kindly give us a short summary of your book?
Okay, because of this, let's say, this Eurocentrism in which I have grown up, also at university, I thought, why not reading as many histories of philosophy from the 15th century up to today and see if there's a difference within these histories. So I read around, I think, 100 histories of philosophy in the libraries of Oxford. And what struck me very much is that all histories of philosophy from the 15th, mostly 16th, 17th, and even up to the 18th century, they are having a universalistic view of the history of philosophy. To give you one example, perhaps the most important history of philosophy was from Brücke, so a critical history of philosophy in the mid of the 18th century, in which he spends 337 pages on philosophy before the Greeks. So he called it barbaric philosophy, but it's not anything to do with barbarism, but people who do not speak Greek. And then he talks almost 1,000 pages about Greek philosophy, of course, rightly so. And then in the Middle Ages, he writes a chapter on philosophy according to the Jews, philosophy according to the Saracens or the Muslims, and the philosophy according to the Christians concerning medieval philosophy. And then he goes up into, let's say, the Renaissance, which was not called the Renaissance yet, and then things became a bit more European. However, it was very clear that there was a broad space for indeed these non-European philosophies, and the same in other histories of philosophy. For example, also l'Encyclopédie of Diderot and d'Alembert, written around the same time, mid-18th century, they say, if they say in their introduction of what is an encyclopedia, they say that all the knowledge of the world is scattered around, and we want to bring it into one book, of course, in many volumes. So the same universalistic idea was with the encyclopedists in France in the 19th century. So, and then suddenly you see this evolving around the same century, so in the 1700s, in the 18th century, into another discourse. I think I found back where that discourse started, and it started in Göttingen in the beginning of the 18th century with Professor Heumann, who wrote many things, but he said, the truth is Christian. Christianity is Europe. Philosophy is about the truth, the love for the truth or wisdom. Philosophy is European. All the other thinkers, they're actually superstitious babblers. It's nonsense. It's just superstition. So it doesn't count. And his view, which you could see as a kind of a strange and minority view in Germany and Göttingen back then, you see the influence of this view becoming bigger and bigger. I have found that Immanuel Kant actually read Heumann, and that Kant, of course, changed his view in the course of his life. When he was a young professor in Königsbergen, his view was still a bit universalistic, and that changed at the end. Then you get up Hegel and so forth, up to the 19th century, where philosophy, I focused on the Arabic philosophy, where the Arabic philosophy disappeared just into one footnote in 1850, which Schleiermacher is saying, and there's some Arabic philosophy, but it doesn't count, briefly speaking. So this Eurocentrism of the 18th and then, of course, the 19th century was very much connected also to the belief that Christianity was superior, that Europe was superior, and so that was the only thing that counts. And we read literally in the introduction to his famous lectures on the history of philosophy from Hegel, that he says, in order to be able to philosophize, you have to be free. And there existed freedom in Greece, so that was a high point of philosophy. But now in the Teutonic order, so in the German regions, the freedom is even bigger. So this is the highlight, is the German philosophy. So there's a connection between Eurocentrism, nationalism, superiority thinking on Christianity that actually pushed away all the philosophies, all the contributions to philosophy, and they did it in such a systematic way that today we have even no idea anymore about them, how it influenced us. So, and I do not blame my professors for not telling me, because their professors and the professors of their professors and so forth were actually raised by in a framework, in a historical framework that had become the norm. And in that way, what I found, and I didn't expect that, honestly speaking, is that our current history of philosophy, and you can read this even in the history of philosophy published in the last 5 or 10 years, it's all the same story: Greece, Middle Ages, Renaissance, Europe, and so forth. So this vision of the history of philosophy is actually a wrong vision, but it is based on ideological choices in the 18th century. So we, as philosophers and historians today, are, without knowing, actually the victims, or you could say the intellectual victims, of ideological choices in the past. Ideological choices that, of course, we should not subscribe to. And that's why it's so necessary to correct this. And if I may add, I talked a bit earlier about the school in Paris and the school in Leuven. And also, which was a thing I didn't expect at all, is that from the second half of the 19th century, thanks to a book of Ernest Renan called Averroes et l'Averroisme, he pointed out, it's a marvelous work. It's hardly readable, but it's a marvelous work. that is pointing out the influence of Averroes on philosophy in the 13th, 14th, 15th century. That was a bomb into the history of philosophy. So people started to read. I mean, that suddenly became an interest mostly in Paris. But then, as said before, I mean, the Pope asked the cardinal in Belgium, the bishops in Belgium, to found a center to study Thomas Aquinas in Leuven and to fight atheism, just like Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century was fighting atheism, more specifically Averroes, but we're going to go deeper into that later, I suppose. And what I saw is that this center, this Catholic school, actually did try to keep out Averroes out of the history of philosophy, even though from the Paris school, they tried to get it back in. So we saw in the 20th century a fight between Paris and Leuven to give Averroes the place that I think he deserves. And to my surprise is that the Catholic school actually has, in general, won the battle. So that's why still today we see much less Averroes in the history of philosophy than he would deserve. So I was totally surprised by this conclusion, because Leuven is also my first university, and they played actually a big role in getting Arabic philosophy out of the history of philosophy.
Very interesting, Dr. Debeuf. So to build on your response, one of our audience members earlier asked, was Averroes nefariously removed by the Europeans in the 1800s, or was it a confluence of factors, intentional and unintentional?
Well, there's a difference, of course, between actors that do deliberately want to write non-European philosophy out of the history of philosophy. So that was a deliberate act. However, some historians of philosophy, I mean, just followed the line and didn't do this deliberately. To give you just one example is that one of the most recent histories of philosophy published by Penguin in 2019 by Anthony Grayling. I mean, he is literally repeating actually the argument of Heumann of the beginning of the 18th century, so the beginning of the 1700s. Saying that actually European thinking is abstract thinking and that's philosophy, while Eastern thinking is actually more theology and wisdom because it's about God. And at the same time, I mean, you would think there's maybe an argument for that. Well, who is the main philosopher in these histories of philosophy of the Middle Ages? It's Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas was, of course, a philosopher, but also a theologian. He writes about God. So he does get a massive place in all histories of philosophy as one of the main philosophers. But Averroes, who is very similar, let's say, than Thomas Aquinas, I mean, he would be a theologian. So you see, they kick out from the history of philosophy all the philosophers because they say it's not philosophy. So, or it's just wisdom, or it's theology, or it's something else. So, and this is still happening. And I'm sure that if we look at today's history of philosophy, that indeed people are not doing this out of ideology. No, it has become a tradition of which we have forgotten why it started. And it started precisely for Eurocentric, ideological, Catholic or Christian reasons. So, and today we have forgotten this, but we are still repeating the same stuff.
In the High Middle Ages, 1100s to about 1300s, there was a scholastic movement of intellectuals who wanted to harmonize religion with rationalism. Do you think that's part of the reason why Averroes and his works were so interesting to European intellectuals at the time?
Well, actually, it started it. So scholasticism is actually using the logic of Aristotle. In Europe, there was only very few chapters known about the logic of Aristotle. So people didn't really know much about this logic. Now, why is this logic so important? Think about the scientific revolution where people just start thinking differently on empiricism and so forth. Say, okay, we can prove this because it has, empirically, it's proven. So
Right.
that's the scientific revolution of the 17th century. In the 13th century, you get a similar kind of revolution, but it's a logical revolution. So through the works of Aristotle and his logic, they were convinced that they could prove things logically. It's a logical proof. So, which in Arabic, for example, is called burhan. So it's proof. Averroes is using this a lot. Things that are proven logically. So it's called demonstrative thinking as well, or syllogistic thinking. So scholasticism is actually using this logic of Aristotle to try to prove things within or with or outside religion. Now, how did Aristotle enter Europe? Well, he was being translated, or a few things of him, in the end of the 12th century out of Arabic. How did that come? Is that Muslim Spain was being conquered by Christian kings. So, and one of the cities that they conquered in the 11th, 12th century was Toledo, where you had big libraries with a lot of Arabic texts, attracted the big intellectuals of Europe at that time, who were actually translators. And they worked in teams with Jewish, Arabic, and Latin translators and tried to get the best translation of this text. But as said before, these translations were very bad. So they couldn't understand Aristotle very well. But then comes a translation of Averroes, in which you don't get suddenly all of the works of Aristotle at once. They didn't know Aristotle in Europe again. But it was not just the works of Aristotle that were translated into Latin, but also the explanations of Averroes. In other words, Europe in the 13th century was reading its new way of thinking, so which was logical thinking, and the applications towards a lot of ideas within and outside religion through the lens and the comments of Averroes. In other words, scholasticism in the 13th and the 14th and even the 15th century came out of these translations and had a massive Arabic influence. It was because of this idea that you can prove things through logic that suddenly there started a battle in Paris between philosophers and theologians. I'll give you one example. Is according to Aristotle and also Averroes and Farabi and so forth, they say it is proven logically that the world is eternal, not created. What was the logic behind that? The logic behind this is, in Latin, they say nihil ex nihilo, or nothing comes out of nothing. That's logic, right? So if nothing comes out of logic, of nothing, that means that matter cannot come out of nothing. In other words, matter has to be eternal. If matter is eternal, it means it's not created. So the world is not created. That's the logic behind it. So they were using this logic to say the world is not created, which goes, of course, against Christian and Muslim and Jewish thought that say that no, the world has been created by God quite a long time ago. So these two visions clashed. And the thing is, why Averroes is important is because he had these applications of all these ideas that were logically proven that were the basis of first kind of secular kind of movement, I would say. And also Averroes, he hated the theologians in Cordoba because the theologians didn't like to use the logic of Aristotle. They just said the Quran and the Hadith and so are true. You cannot discuss it. He says, no, there is also something else. So this hatred for the theologians was then also copied in Paris. So the philosophy faculty, which was a kind of bachelor faculty, and the master faculty was theology, medicine, or law. Suddenly the philosopher said, no, our truth is more important than theological truth. And so you can feel already that this was creating a massive clash in a very, very Catholic and church-dominated Europe. So that's why they saw Averroes as not just as an atheist, but also as a very dangerous thinker for all the philosophers in Europe, because he made them think in a different way.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. So the European interest in Averroes that first started in the 1200s, what was the perspective on Islam and the Arab world at that time in Europe? Was there any anti-Islam perspective that Europeans in general had, whether they were theologians or otherwise? Did European intellectuals see Averroes as a rational communicator of ancient Greek philosophy who was, in a sense, separate from and an outlier to Islamic civilization and Islam itself?
Well, interestingly, they did indeed. When I read, let's say, the works of the 13th century criticizing Averroes and others, they were never using some Islamophobic argument or anti-Arab arguments, actually. There is one book, for example, it's called The Errors of the Philosophers, written by Gilles of Rome in 1270. So, in which he criticizes the philosophers. And who are the philosophers? It's interesting. These philosophers are Aristotle, Al-Kindi, Averroes, Avicenna, Ghazali, and Maimonides. Maimonides was a Jewish Arabic philosopher. He wrote in Arabic. In the 13th century, for them, the philosophers were actually Arabs or Arabic writing people. And the Islamic or Arabic argument is not used. They are just seeing that philosophy is actually a Greek Arabic thing that is not welcome in Europe. That was the argument. And they are discussing the content, but never the fact that it comes from the Islamic world at all. Rather on the contrary, but now I'm going a bit 1 century earlier, is one well-known European thinker, is Abelard, who was also very critical towards things in the scripture. And he has not just only, he has been exiled and so forth, been castrated, terrible life. And in one of his last books, you can see that he wrote a book about a conversation between a Christian thinker, a Jewish thinker, and then a philosopher. And this philosopher clearly had more open ideas. So when he was in the Abbey of Cluny in the 12th century, where he also died, so he clearly had this idea that in the Islamic world, or certainly in Spain, that was a bit known, of course, back then from Cluny, is that you could think much more freely. There was more freedom of thinking, freedom of speaking in the Arab world and the Islamic world than in Europe. So that was an idea that was known to some thinkers indeed in the 12th century. And that's, I think, also an interesting idea.
Thank you. Is there a difference in opinion between European scholars about the influence of Averroes on European thought?
Absolutely. I have to make an important historical point first. So when Averroes was introduced in Europe, mostly in Paris in the 13th century, with these heretic ideas, and the people who followed these ideas at the University of Paris, they were called Averroists. However, Averroes was seen as a kind of an atheist, so a heretic, and nobody called himself an Averroist, because then you would call yourself a heretic and you could be excommunicated by the church, or even worse, being killed. So nobody called himself an Averroist, but the enemies of these ideas called this group the Averroists. And one of the first who called them was Thomas Aquinas. So because of this connection that was so dangerous with Averroes, it is very difficult to trace back ideas of Averroes and European thinkers in the 13th, 14th, 15th century. It's only in the 16th century that one of the major Italian philosophers calls himself an Averroist. So, and now we're 4 centuries later, it's still on the agenda. So if we want to trace back these ideas, it is difficult. You have to do a real history of ideas, a kind of archaeology of ideas. And the ones who today, some say, okay, these ideas are clearly coming from Averroes or from Arabic ideas. The line is very clear. However, the others who are against it say, there's no proof. This is not coming from Averroes. These ideas are just a kind of radicalization of Aristotle. Again, For example, the idea on the eternity of the world, not the creation, if they say, yeah, that's just Aristotle, that's not Averroes. So they just followed Aristotle, and Averroes had played no role in the 13th, 14th, and so forth centuries. So with this argument, they try to block the influence, the historiography of the influence of Averroes. And to my surprise, even in the 20th century, that movement of scholars was still very much alive. So indeed, by a deep conviction that they had and by great scholarship, but that was also with an ideological agenda. So to keep them say, no, it is European. So the link Aristotle and some thinkers in the 13th century is just a link, as a European link, is a link Aristotle and, for example, Seeger of Brabant. So when you take out Averroes, you take out the entire influence of the Arabic or Islamic tradition. So, and they succeeded in this, and that's why even up to today, we cannot find, it's hard to grasp the massive influence Averroes, but also others, have had on European thinking.
Very interesting. And do you think today, in these times when there seems to be an effort by academia to acknowledge and recognize the contributions of the non-European world, including Averroes, how strong is the disagreement today between scholars who might disagree on the role of Averroes in Europe's intellectual legacy? And is this changing more towards accepting that he had a much bigger role than previously acknowledged? Or is it still pretty much a constant disagreement that continues? How do you think this will evolve?
Well, I have written a chapter on where I try to trace one idea from Averroes. Well, that maybe was not entirely his idea, but saying that parts of religion are wrong, but that religion can be useful in order for the rulers to keep people in line. So, and how this idea might have gone through in all funny and different ways, even towards the idea of a civil religion by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I sent this article to one scholar in Italy, and he responded immediately like, oh, you are making the same mistake as one of the scholars in the beginning of the 20th century, who was a scholar of the Paris school. He's saying, you're making the same mistake, it's just Cicero. In other words, I mean, and I'm talking about a few years ago, I mean, these schools are still there, and this fight is still going on by people indeed who think this role is being exaggerated by people who, like progressive people who want to include other thinking traditions into our traditions, but in reality, this is a fake exercise. So it is very much there. Maybe you could say it's out of conviction, or it's just out of tradition, or whatever the reason is. So it is still there. I almost must say that the work, the academic scholarly work, the research on the real links have not been done, are not enough. I mean, I'm just to give you another example. What is the influence of Indian philosophy on Greek philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy? What is the influence of Japanese philosophy on Heidegger? What is the influence, and so forth and so forth. And there are some small studies left and right, but it is not very systematic. And the result of the fact that it's not very systematic means that for some people it's also not convincing. And if it's not convincing, why would I change my history of philosophy if the arguments are not convincing enough or not large enough and so forth? So I think we are, I mean, making a rhetorical argument out of cosmopolitanism that we should do this, I think, is the wrong one. So we should do it with hard, very good research. And this is one thing I have tried. I'm not sure I succeeded, but there's so much work that still needs to be done, honestly speaking.
Is there any way to build on your research to better understand the legacy of Arab philosophers and scholars and their influence on European history? Starting with Averroes, what can be done to yield further insights?
Well, I think there is still a lot of work to do. So basically, it's also rereading and revisiting the research that has been done in order to keep him out, and rereading that because they have done great work, but of course, I mean, to get him out. So, and I think reusing these sources and rereading things perhaps in a different way with an other methodology, I think it would be a great start indeed. So, and looking into the works basically of the 13th, 14th, and up to the 6th century, and saying, okay, what can we trace back here? Knowing well that they don't call themselves Averroes or that they are quoting Averroes or using a reference to him. No, they don't. But by revisiting this tradition, and we know the names, but perhaps there are other names. So, and it's something that they are doing in Paris also today. But the problem is that these studies are published in French, and that unfortunately these days that many scholars outside France can't read the French anymore. So it does not influence or hardly influences the thinking and the scholarship outside France, and that's a big problem.
Thank you. What words of wisdom can you give to both me and our audience about all this work you have done? I'm sure there's a lot more you can say about the topic, but there are many people who have an interest in discovering the real legacy of not just Arabs, but also other non-European scholars who have been marginalized or not recognized as much as they should. What advice or thoughts can you kindly share with us to address that? Thank you.
For me, it is not merely a question about marginalization or looking in a more broad way. I think what is at stake here is the real history of philosophy and the story that, I mean, it all started in Greece, then forgotten, then found back, and then went into the Renaissance and so forth, is just wrong and not very interesting. The reality is that Greek philosophy got many ideas from Egypt and India via Persia, that these ideas then went to Alexandria when Athens was becoming less powerful. From Alexandria, they actually went to Haran, which is in Turkey today. From there, they went to Baghdad. In Baghdad, they were clearly mixed again with Persian and Indian ideas, and maybe also Chinese ideas. From there, they moved to Cairo and to Cordoba. From Cordoba, they moved to France and Paris, indeed, in the 13th century. From Paris, they moved to Italy, where they started the Renaissance. And when the Renaissance was over, they went to the Netherlands, Germany, and England, and, for example, got Spinoza and so forth. So, and from there, they went back to France, to Paris, where we see these ideas coming back in the French Revolution. So, for me, the history of philosophy is a journey that goes in a way not just around the Mediterranean, but also broader, with new ideas popping in. To say it another way, we often see now today history of philosophy like the Nile. You know, we have two arms of the Nile, the blue and the white Nile, and then goes in one line up to the Mediterranean. Well, no, the history of philosophy is like the Amazon River, where you have influences, pieces of water where we don't know, does it go into the Amazon or is it the other way around? Is this water going forward or back? Who are the small rivers coming in? Is this what? So the Amazon is unknown, it's complex, but it's interesting. And what I see, I mean, and what I'm convinced of, is that not just Arabic philosophy, but also many other cultures and philosophical traditions have actually made fundamental contribution to what we think now is the history of philosophy. And all this thinking has been influenced by many different traditions. And to me, that is a much more interesting way of thinking than just Thales of Greece, Renaissance Europe. So, but in order to give flesh to the bone, of course, much more research needs to be done. What I see is not just in European history of philosophy, but also even early Christian philosophers like Origen, or Al-Farabi in Baghdad. For them, it was this journey that was the history of philosophy. And it was by purpose written out, changed as a story, And I just think we have to take back the old story and do research about it and give indeed flesh to that bone. And we will come up suddenly with a complete different way of thinking, not just about philosophy, but about contributions worldwide from all different kinds of perspectives, traditions, cultures, and so forth, to a human history that is much more fascinating, I think, than what we see and read now in the books that are being published.
Very interesting. Thank you. And two more questions before we end. So the first question is, what is your current project? Or I can ask, what is your next project or research you're doing? Does it have to do with Averroes or the broader philosophical topics that you mentioned just now? Is there any project you are focusing on?
Well, I'm also seen here as a Middle East expert, so I've been writing on the history of the Middle East. So I know it's a different thing, but at the same time, I'm also actually looking into, indeed, Indian influence on Greek philosophy. And if everything goes well, I will have also a PhD student that will do research into that particular point. So it's something perhaps completely different, but the idea is the same, is getting this journey into the history of philosophy. And there are some very, very interesting elements there. But again, it's going to be a work that is going to be fascinating, but also going to be very challenging. So, yeah. And it's a complete, I mean, it's instead of the 13th, 12th and 13th century, now we're going indeed to the 5th, 4th, and perhaps 3rd century BC.
Yeah.
So it's a complete different thing. But I think it's going to be extremely interesting to see what are the links there, because the so-called Greek miracle, which has also been used as the European miracle of Greek ancient philosophy, I think that's a myth, and that's perhaps an important myth that we have to fight. I mean, fight is the wrong word, but to give much more nuance. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. And finally, Dr. Debeuf, so I understand that the ebook of your book was available last month, November 2024, from Bloomsbury. When is the hardcover scheduled to be released? Is it still December 26, 2024?
The hardcover, which is unfortunately very expensive, is can be purchased from the 26th of December,
Great.
indeed. Or at least it will be published then, so you can already purchase it, I think, now. And they also told me that actually a soft cover will come out, but that will be a year from now.
Okay.
So if you're very curious, then we'll have to go for the hardcover. Or I would suggest actually convince the head of your library where you're going or working or whatever to buy it, so you do not have to buy it yourself, but you can go and read it in the library. So, and of course, that's the choice you can make. So, but I'm happy for the interest. I can see it's that there is some interest in the book. So I can only thank you for this podcast and for the efforts you have been doing, well, and helping it known that this book exists.
Thank you once again, Dr. Koert Debeuf, author of The Influence of Averroes on European Thought, The Disappearance of Latin Averroism from the History of Philosophy. Thank you for this enlightening and thought-provoking discussion. Your insights into the disappearance of Latin Averroism from the history of philosophy have truly illuminated the enduring relevance of Averroes' legacy. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
And to our audience, thank you for joining us on this intellectual journey. Stay curious, keep asking questions, and remember, the pursuit of knowledge is the bridge that connects us to deeper understanding. Until next time, bye for now.